Official welcome to the Forgotten Fable, a quiet corner of the archive for history lovers, vintage souls, and the endlessly curious. Here, we like to dust off stories that rarely made it into our history books, wander through forgotten places, unusual lives, and the darker chapters that time has nearly erased. Whether you're here to learn something new, unwind after a long day, or maybe you're simply here to let an old story keep you company while you fall asleep, work, or clean, stay a while and see what we uncover today. I think it was a little too dark in the beginning, so I messed with some lighting, and excuse me while I'm figuring it out. Let's dive in, shall we? I've been meaning to do a full-length podcast for the Forgotten Fable. I love history, and this is something that I just want to do for fun. So if you've clicked on this video, if you've subscribed, if any of that, just thank you right off the bat. If you see some cats running around, they do love attention, so if they see a camera on, they will find a way to make it on the screen. So today we're going over the history of Asylums. Yeah, we're going there. Right away, maybe you're thinking American Horror Story Asylum season? Question mark. Before we begin and get any deeper into the topic of asylums, I just want to clarify exactly what I mean when I'm using the term asylums throughout this video. The history of psychiatric institutions spans centuries and can look very different depending on the time period and the country. There's no real single asylum experience that fit everybody or that represents everyone. For this specific episode of Asylums here on the Forgotten Fable, we are primarily looking at the 19th century asylums in Britain and in the United States, particularly around the 1830s through the end of the Victorian era. So I just kind of want you guys to know not only what to expect in this episode, what history we are exactly digging into here. I chose this time period because this is a time when the public asylums were expanding largely and rapidly. Also, ideas about mental illness and treatment were changing, and institutions that were originally created as places for refuge, treatment, were beginning to hold a very large, enormous amount of patients. Conditions could vary greatly throughout these institutions. They often change throughout the centuries when we look back at the history of them. So when we talk about treatment today, the daily life or the experience of patients, it's very, very important to remember that we're looking at a very broad and evolving system and not one universal experience. And with that in mind, to understand what these institutions became what we remember today, we first have to understand, why was the asylum created in the first place? Imagine you are being told you're insane. You disagree, of course, but your disagreement doesn't matter. Your family, do they believe you? No, actually, they signed the paperwork already for you to go to the asylum. And soon, before you know it, the doors of the asylum have closed shut behind you. For some people in the 19th century, this wasn't a nightmare. This wasn't an episode of American Horror Story. No. This was their real life. And once you were inside the asylum, once you walked through those heavy security doors, proving that you didn't belong there was much harder than it was to get in. But the history of the asylum isn't quite as simple as we see it today. So these institutions, they were not originally created to torture people. In fact, many were built with the intention to do something far more compassionate. I guess that's the right word. They were actually aiming to help. Somewhere along the way, though, something went wrong. Places that were once created to be sanctuaries no longer were. They became something much different. So taking it back in time, before the rise of the 19th century asylum, someone suffering from a very serious mental illness had very, very few options. Some people remained at home with their families, others ended in poorhouses, things like hospitals, institutions where confinement was often more important than treatment itself, or even prisons. During the late 18th and 19th century, reformers began proposing a different option, a different approach, if you will. They wanted to make a change. They wanted to bring change to people with mental illnesses. And that was the asylum. And the original meaning of the word is very important. An asylum was meant to be a place of refuge or a sanctuary. The idea, surprisingly simple. Someone experiencing mental illness could be removed from the pressure of everyday life, all that chaos going on every day, take them out of it. Instead, place them somewhere more quiet where they would get regular meals, fresh air, there would be gardens for them to roam around, they would get exercise, would have the opportunities to do meaningful work, recreation, and predictability in a daily routine. All of this, right? If you know anything about mental health or you have a psychology background like me, there is research that everything mentioned in these ideas has a positive impact on someone's mental health. And this specific philosophy became known as moral treatment. Despite how sinister the word asylum sounds to many of us nowadays, many of these institutions were not designed to look frightening, be frightening, or create an image of something like a prison in someone's mind. They were often deliberately built outside of cities, surrounded by farmland, landscape grounds. They were designed to have large windows that would bring in enormous amounts of sunlight. Remember, sunlight, vitamin D, good for the brain. The environment itself was a part of the treatment. The word asylum immediately brings a picture of Briarcliff Manor from American Horror Story, the season Asylum. The reality, at least in the beginning, was very different. Remove the serial killers, remove the demonic possession, and picture something so much more quiet, peaceful, zen. Once someone entered an asylum, they also surrendered a remarkable amount of control. The institution could determine when you woke up, when you ate, when you went to sleep, when you worked, when you exercised, when you went outside. There was a loss of autonomy in these asylums. Men and women were generally housed separately, and their daily work reflected that of the 19th century gender roles and gender expectations. Male patients might be expected to work in the farms, maintain the grounds, or work in workshops, whereas female patients were more commonly assigned to laundry, cooking, sewing, cleaning, things like that. In fact, doctors believed that this kind of occupation could actually be very therapeutic. Having something meaningful to provide a daily routine and even distraction or purpose, that was the key. That's what these doctors thought. They're like, yup, this will heal them. But there was also another practical benefit. That's right. You thought that was it? Nope. There's more. Patients doing these jobs is what helped keep these enormous institutions running. So the doctors, reformers, everyone that sat in an office and thought of these great things. So who's gonna keep up with the grounds of the institution? Who's gonna cook and who's gonna clean? We're gonna lose money that way. Oh, but wait, the patients, they can work. And that leaves us with the very uncomfortable gray areas. And that appears many times throughout asylum history. Something could genuinely be considered therapeutic for the patient while also being extremely useful to the institution imposing it. And life inside of these institutions wasn't necessarily miserable either. Again, the images of American Horror Story come to mind. However, some institutions maintained libraries and organized concerts. Now, who was singing? That's what I want to know. Maybe it wasn't therapeutic. If someone was just horrible at singing, that might do the opposite. I don't know. I'm not trying to make a joke out of it, but like, I can't handle that. There was theatrical performances, so you can be part of theater, outdoor recreation, even dances. Those details are important because the people inside the asylums were not simply nameless beings walking throughout, being told when to wake up, when to eat, and silently sitting behind the locked doors. They still had lives. They read, they worked, they farmed, they made friendships, and patiently waited for news from home, wondering if they're getting out soon. Some eventually did recover and leave, and on the other hand, some remained for years. And beneath all of those routines was one simple fact that separated them from ordinary life. You were not necessarily free to leave whenever you wanted, and that's where history becomes far more complicated. Many patients were seriously experiencing psychiatric illness. Oftentimes it could even be a neurological illness or a physical illness that doctors in the 19th century just were struggling to understand. Some common diagnoses included terms such as melancholy, dementia, or mania. But at this time, medicine did not yet divide psychiatry with neurology, intellectual disability, and social care in the same way that we do today. A person experiencing epilepsy could end up in an asylum, and so could someone suffering from severe alcoholism, dementia, psychosis, or neurological damage caused by things such as syphilis. So mental illness was very real, but the ways that doctors interpreted that illness was heavily influenced by the society they lived in. And for women, that becomes especially important. 19th century physicians often connected women's health, specifically their mental health, to their reproductive health. Much of medical literature discussed mental disturbances often associated with menstruation, pregnancy, childbirth, breastfeeding, and menopause. Some of these observations were not entirely misguided. Doctors recognized that severe psychiatric illness could sometimes follow childbirth. Something we now understand can include conditions such as postpartum psychosis. But the problem was that genuine illnesses were being looked at through 19th century ideas about the female body and what exactly a woman was supposed to be. A respectable woman was generally supposed to be, or expected to be, maternal, affectionate, sexually restrained, completely devoted to her household, her family, her husband. So when a woman's behavior changed drastically, say for example, she dramatically became aggressive or sexually expressive, maybe she began to reject her children, even abandon domestic responsibility. Maybe she behaved in ways that weren't socially normal or socially accepted. Doctors were not evaluating those behaviors in a cultural vacuum to say. One of the diagnoses that is most famously associated with women is hysteria. Hysteria could encompass a wide variety of symptoms. This would include fainting, paralysis, seizure-like episode, pain, sensory disturbances, and very intense emotional episodes. Surprisingly, men could be diagnosed with hysteria as well. But over centuries, hysteria became deeply associated with women, their bodies, and assumptions about women's emotions. Women that experienced genuine mental illness were living in a society that had already very specific ideas for how a woman should behave, how a woman should express her emotions, and exactly what her role should be within the family. Those expectations didn't exist separately from medicine. They actually could influence how a woman's behavior was described, interpreted, and ultimately understood. And for a married woman, there was another person whose judgment could carry a very considerable amount of weight, and that would be her husband. In the 19th century, marriage wasn't simply a private relationship. It could shape a woman's legal independence, her finances, and even in some circumstances, it could determine her ability to challenge decisions being made about her own mental state. And there are a few stories out there that demonstrate this imbalance of power better than that of the Elizabeth Packard. In 1860, there was this woman named Elizabeth Packard. At the time, she was a 43-year-old mother of 6 children, and she was married to a man, Reverend Theophilus Packard, a Calvinist minister. Now, over the course of their marriage, Elizabeth had began developing her own religious beliefs, and they increasingly differed from that of her husband. She began to question parts of his religion. She spoke openly about these questions. She spoke openly about her own ideas, and she asserted that she had the right to her own interpretation about religion. Theophilus began to believe that his wife's behavior and increasingly unconventional religious beliefs were evidence enough to say that she was mentally ill. Of course, Elizabeth insisted that she was sane, but it gets more complex. Decades before her marriage, Elizabeth had experienced a mental crisis. Some of her later theological ideas were unusual enough that a physician interpreted them as possible evidence of a mental disturbance. But basically, the disturbing part was what happened with Elizabeth and when she disagreed with her diagnoses. At the time, Illinois law afforded a married woman fewer protections against commitment initiated by her husband. And on June 18th of 1860, Elizabeth was taken from her home and committed to the Illinois State Hospital for the Insane of Jacksonville. She would then remain there for approximately 3 years. And during her confinement, Elizabeth repeated consistently, and she was very insistent that she was sane and she was not supposed to be in there. She even attempted to convince the hospital superintendent of the time, and that was Dr. Andrew McFarland. She really tried to convince him she didn't belong there, and if anyone had enough pull on that decision, whether she was released or kept there, it would be him, right? So she worked on that for a long while, but eventually their relationship deteriorated. Elizabeth began observing the treatment of other patients around her. She would document conditions that she considered abuse, and she would even challenge the authority of the system herself. Eventually, McFarland did agree that Elizabeth can leave the institution, but he didn't decide to release her because he felt that she should be free or that he thought she was sane. It was actually the opposite. He decided that she was incurably sane. So from there, Elizabeth returns home to the wonderful Reverend, who, by the way, still believed that his wife was mentally ill, and he went even further to confine her to the home. But this time, Elizabeth managed to get a word out to someone outside of their home, and eventually legal action did follow. So in January of 1864, she was finally given the opportunity to defend her sanity before a jury. The trial lasted 5 days, and witnesses testified about Elizabeth's behavior, her religious beliefs, and physicians even disagreed about whether those beliefs demonstrated real mental illness. The jury was left to deliberate, and according to historical records, they returned approximately 7 minutes later, and their verdict was that Elizabeth Packard was sane. Elizabeth would spend much of her life after that advocating for greater legal protections for married women and people confined in mental institutions. Now, her story isn't said to provide proof that every woman in the 19th century in a psychiatric institution was sane or anything like that, or wrongfully committed. Does show, however, is how difficult it really could be to challenge a psychiatric judgment when the people also making the judgment possessed the authority to basically take away your freedom. Once someone entered an asylum, treatment they received could vary enormously, and that would depend on the institution, the decade, their condition, and sometimes even their social class. And this is another place where popular television or horror films can distort our timeline a little bit. If American Horror Story, the season Asylum, has you picturing lobotomies and electroshock therapy, we're actually a little bit earlier than that in the timeline of it all. Lobotomies began in the 20th century, and electroconvulsive therapy wasn't actually introduced until 1938. So we're not going to be going into that yet, but maybe another episode. In the 19th century, what was really happening then? Well, patients were actually more likely to be involved in a structured routine, work, bathing, medication, or sedative drugs. In some circumstances, some physical restraint would be used. Water also had a long history of psychiatric treatment. For example, warm baths might be used to calm a patient, while cold water and showers might be used for different therapeutic treatments. Mechanical restraints were also used, such as straitjackets, straps, or other devices to limit movement, basically. Physicians could argue that restraints were necessary to stop a severely agitated patient from not only harming themselves, but harming others. But this is when reformers began to ask serious questions. Was restraining actually helping a patient, or was it simply making the patient easier to manage? During the 19th century, a major non-restraint movement began taking place, and this developed in Britain, and some institutions dramatically reduced or eliminated mechanical restraints. So it was an important reform, but eliminating restraints didn't necessarily eliminate coercion. In some institutions, seclusion became another way of managing patients. Instead of restraining someone, attendants could place them alone in a room. And this is where the line between treatment and control becomes difficult to separate. A warm bath could genuinely soothe someone and calm them down. A quiet room could give someone a place to calm down. Work could provide routine and purpose. But the experience changes when the person has no option to refuse it. Throughout asylum history, care and control existed alongside each other, and sometimes the difference depended entirely on if someone had the option to say no. Now, because women's stories like Elizabeth Packard, for example, have become such powerful examples of asylum history, it's easy to forget that men also made a substantial portion of asylum population. Male patients could arrive to psychiatric institutions because of severe psychiatric illness, but also because of conditions that the 19th century institutions didn't clearly separate as clearly from psychiatry. Alcohol-related illnesses were significant among men, as were epilepsy and neurological disorders. One of the most devastating was general paralysis of the insane, and that was associated with late-stage syphilis. It could cause changes in personality, judgment, illusions, cognitive decline, neurological deterioration, and eventually even death. There was simply no antibiotic treatment for it. And for some of these patients, the asylum wasn't simply somewhere people went for psychiatric treatment. In early philosophy of moral treatment, it basically depended on something that became increasingly difficult to maintain, and that was small institutions. Doctors and attendants were supposed to know their patients. Treatment was supposed to be individualized, and the environment itself was supposed to help someone recover. But throughout the 19th century, people entered public asylums, and many didn't leave. Some had chronic psychiatric conditions, others had dementia, neurological diseases, or disabilities for which medicine had very little effective treatment for. Beds were filled, but now patients continued arriving. By the end of the century, institutions originally imagined for relatively small populations could house more than 1,000. For example, in England in 1806, the average asylum housed 115 patients. By 1900, that average grew to over 1,000 patients. And maintaining individualized care becomes very different when your population size grows so large. Now there's not enough beds, there's not enough doctors, attendants, or resources. Some patients remained institutionalized for decades, and you can see where gradually the purpose of the asylum begins to change. Instead of asking only how someone could recover, institutions increasingly had to ask a much more practical question: how do we care for and manage this many people? So treatment became increasingly management. and management could become long-term custody. Some asylums grew into enormous self-contained communities with farms, workshops, laundries, kitchens, all those things we talked about earlier, even including cemeteries. A patient could enter the world of an asylum and live there for years, sometimes even the rest of their life. And as institutions continued to grow, become overpopulated, the distance between the original ideals of moral treatment and the reality inside public asylums grew even wider. By the late 19th century, people outside of those walls were beginning to ask questions. And even one young journalist decided she wanted to see the conditions for herself. In 1887, 23-year-old Nellie Bly accepted an extraordinary assignment from the New York World. She would pretend to be mentally ill, convince doctors to commit her, enter the women's lunatic asylum in Blackwell, and report back on what she witnessed. Using the name Nellie Brown, Bly had the opportunity to behave strangely enough in front of the women's boarding house that authorities were called to. She was examined, passed through the hospital, and eventually found herself committed to Blackwell's Island. So her plan had worked. Once she was inside, however, Nellie stopped pretending. She behaved normally, she spoke rationally, but that did not immediately change the judgment that had already been made about her. So, for the next 10 days, Bly experienced the asylum life for herself, and specifically from that of the patient's point of view. She later described cold baths, inadequate food, long periods of forced inactivity, overcrowding, humiliation, and also attendants who she accused of physically abusing female patients. She also wrote about immigrant patients who spoke very little English and whom she believed were there not because they were mentally ill, but rather because they couldn't communicate effectively with their doctors what they were experiencing. Now, whether every patient that Bly considered sane was actually sane, we'll never know. But the communication problem that she observed is definitely something to question. Now, Nellie had something that many of the patients around her did not. Someone outside of the asylum knew exactly where she was, and they intended to bring her home. After 10 days, the newspaper arranged for her release. Her reporting was later collected as 10 Days in a Madhouse, exposing conditions of the asylum to a very large audience. Eventually, a grand jury did investigate the asylum, and recommendations were made involving staff, food, medical supervision, and even overcrowding. Now, Nellie's reporting was not solely the reason for the reform here. Concerns about conditions and funding already existed, but her investigation brought public attention to what life really could look like in the institution. Now, following that, for institutions across, reform didn't happen right away. People like Elizabeth Packard challenged commitment laws and fought for patients' rights. Nellie Bly and other journalists exposed institutional conditions. Patients published memoirs, doctors would debate about treatment practices, investigators entered hospitals to investigate, and laws would gradually change. But the traditional psychiatric hospital didn't simply disappear by the end of the Victorian era. Large state institutions remained very important for mental health care well into the 20th century, eventually changing legal standards, new psychiatric medicines, civil rights, and a growing movement towards community-based mental health care would lead to deinstitutionalization. Large numbers of people left these hospitals. But even that isn't a neat ending, right? Community mental health systems didn't always receive the resources necessary to support those leaving the institutions. Mental health care continued to change, and of course it does the same today. The reality of asylums and psychiatric institutions is much more complicated than that we usually see in, say, TV or movies. Not every doctor was cruel, not every patient was secretly sane or tortured. Not every asylum was a place of constant suffering, is what I'm trying to say. But none of that and none of what was talked about in this video is said to minimize the suffering that patients did experience. In fact, for many patients, institutionalization meant losing all control of their life. And that being some of the most basic parts, right? choosing when they can eat, when they can sleep, when they can wake up, and especially when they could see their families again. Overcrowding, neglect, forced treatment, restraint, isolation, outright abuse was very real, even when treatment was given to patients with sincere medical intentions. The person receiving it did not always have the ability to refuse it, and that's what makes this history so difficult to reduce to either that of a horror story or that of medical progress. Because many asylums did genuinely begin with a compassionate idea that people experiencing mental illness deserved care rather than imprisonment, abandonment, or chains. But those same institutions were also given complete, enormous authority over the people they were supposed to protect. Ultimately, the history of the asylum is not about the buildings, rather it's about the people that lived inside them. It's about the people who recovered and went home, or the ones who were not given the option. Some desperately needed the care they received, and some were terribly failed by the institutions that were supposed to protect them. And some patients may have never belonged there at all in the first place. Many of their names have disappeared with history. Their experiences are what help change the way we think about mental illness, patient rights, and what it means to care for someone without taking away their humanity. These are the stories worth pulling out of the archive. Until next time, let the past linger a little longer, and I'll see you in the next video.